Good evening, everyone. I'll give you all a couple minutes to join us. Good evening, everyone. I'm just waiting a few more minutes for everyone to join us. Welcome. Welcome. How are you? Welcome. Good evening, everyone. Hello. I'm happy that you all are joining us this evening. Welcome. So, good evening, everyone. Hello. Hello. Good evening. So, welcome to our virtual Gallier gathering. We are the Hermann-Grima and Gallier Historic Houses. I am Dr. Anastasia Scott, Director of Educational Programming. Gatherings are being offered to you for free in this virtual platform. If you like our programming, please become a member. Membership has its perks. If you are not a Louisiana or New Orleans resident, you can take advantage of the North American Reciprocal Museum Association, where you can receive membership benefits with museums and cultural institutions across the United States, Canada, Bermuda, El Salvador, and Mexico. Membership also helps with sponsoring programs such as this. 2021 is our 140th anniversary of the Women's Exchange, our owner and operators, and the 50th anniversary of the museum. Please join us in celebrating our anniversary by becoming a member. If you are impacted financially by COVID-19, we are offering student memberships for $25. If you join now, your membership is good through January 2022. If you wish to support us in other ways, please visit our online gift shop to purchase unique gifts from our inventory composed of items from women entrepreneurs, artists, and artisans. You can also make monetary donations for our many programs and initiatives that we offer. We are also listed on the Amazon Smile charity website if you wish to donate more tangible items we need for our operations. The Hermann-Grima and Gallier Historic Houses, managed by the Women's Exchange, aims to preserve and maintain the architecture and decorative arts of the homes so they may act as a microcosm of life during the 19th and 20th centuries, to inspire educational experiences and discourse around our collective past and its contribution to the culture of New Orleans. At the end of each Gallier gathering is a survey we send out asking for your feedback. We would like to inform you that this speaker is the result of your requests. Please know that we read your feedback and try to make this content as relevant as we can. So please fill out the survey we send out after each Gallier gathering. Your feedback is valuable. In his talk, Mark Roudané will reveal the little known history of L'Union, the South's first Black newspaper, and the New Orleans Tribune, America's first Black daily. A powerful and successful campaign for racial justice coalesced around these groundbreaking journals. Mark Charles Roudané is the sixth generation New Orleanian. He is the great-great-grandson of Dr. Louis Charles Roudané, founder of the South's first Black newspaper, L'Union, as well as the New Orleans Tribune, America's first Black daily. Inspired by his heritage, Mark has spent the last decade passionately researching these groundbreaking journals in order to bring this inspirational and unrepresented history to the general public, or should I say underrepresented. His book, The New Orleans Tribune, An Introduction to America's First Black Daily Newspaper, has reached a wide audience. Roudané's articles have appeared in numerous journals, including South Atlantic Review, the Journal of the Louisiana Creole Research Association, New America, The Atlantic, and 64 Parishes. This talk will be recorded and available for viewing in 24 hours on our YouTube channel and website. Please feel free to subscribe to our YouTube channel so you won't miss out on any future programming that we offer. If you have any questions at any point during the lecture, please save them until the end or submit your questions, or submit your questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Without further ado, I present to you Mr. Mark Roudané.
Thank you, Dr. Scott. It's an honor to share the story of these two remarkable newspapers, L'Union and the New Orleans Tribune. The voices that are captured in these papers provide us with a bottoms-up history of a powerful freedom movement centered in New Orleans during the Civil War and Reconstruction eras. As I share extracts from the papers, I invite you to consider the strong line connecting the radical politics embodied in these journals with the modern anti-racist movement. Echoes from this past remind us to collectively educate, agitate, organize, build solidarity, and fight for fundamental systemic change, not incremental reforms. Reading La Union and La Tribune, I am inspired to challenge the symbols and systems of white supremacy and imagine a just world for all. I hope you will be inspired as well. You're looking at the inaugural edition of L'Union, issued on September 27th, 1862, just 5 months after Union forces captured New Orleans. You can see it features an editorial called L'Esclavage, a scathing editorial by editor Paul Draven, and also contains passionate correspondence from Victor Hugo. This is the header for the inaugural edition of the New Orleans Tribune, first issued on July 21st, 1864. You can see that they commented later that year that the Tribune succeeded the Union, which was the organ of the downtrodden race of Louisiana, published in a time when some courage was required in the city of New Orleans to utter words of loyalty and truth. Some courage indeed to publish a Black newspaper in the belly of the Confederacy. It never ceases to amaze me that these men wrote what they did and lived to see the next edition. This extract from the March 5th, 1865 edition: "The defense of the weak against the mighty, of the oppressed against the oppressor, is a noble and holy cause. It is a cause that, in spite of all impediments, obstacles, and intrigues of our enemies, we are proud of contending for. We ask justice, full justice for all. We do not care for the obstacles we may find in our way or the enemies we may find against us. The men who oppose such a platform can only be the enemies of our race. Do not say that we are going too fast or going too far. We ask any candid man, is freedom complete? Is the Black in the full enjoyment of all he has a right to obtain? If not, why should we stop in our efforts to have justice done to our race?" This is the last known image taken in 1889 of Tribune founder Dr. Louis Charles Roudané, free man of color, my great-great-grandfather. Roudané's parents were born in the French colony of Saint-Domingue, now Haiti. His mother was enslaved. His father was white, or perhaps mixed race. Some with the Roudané surname were enslaved, some were free people of color, and some were white owners of a small coffee plantation in Dondon. Some rose up, some perished, and some fled soon after the uprising started in August of 1791. This portrait by Haitian-born artist and New Orleans resident Ulrich Jean-Pierre. Roudané's parents ended up in St. James Parish on the Branger plantations. The family moved to New Orleans around 1830, and young Louis Charles was later sent to Paris to receive his education. He attended the Faculty of Medicine, where he studied under prominent Republican activists and took to the barricades during the 1848 French Revolution, a revolution that brought a permanent end to slavery in the French world and legalized Black voting rights and Black representation to French government. Imbued with the ideals of liberté, égalité, et fraternité, Louis Charles returned to New Orleans in 1857, a city far different than the one he had known during the so-called golden age of free people of color. Americanization was in full force. The population of free people of color was smaller. Legal restrictions and prejudices against free people of color had increased dramatically, and the distinctions between free Blacks and the enslaved had narrowed. The tripartite social order established by the Code Noir, white, free-colored, and enslaved, was rapidly becoming an American Black and white world. Dr. Roudané found himself in the nation's largest slave trading center, where over the years, over 120,000 men, women, and children were stored in pens, assigned a price, and sold as living property. And you can see in this map, there are numerous red dots in and around the French Quarter and in the American sector, a few over on the downriver side of Esplanade, all of those dots were slave trading sites. Meet Dr. Louis Charles Roudané, then 34 years old in this picture, hand in his jacket. He's posing calmly and confidently before his marriage to a free woman of color, Célie Soleil. He established a medical practice on Custom House Street in the French Quarter and began raising a family. Everything changed in the spring of 1862. Union troops occupied, or should I say liberated, New Orleans, and wartime reconstruction, Lincoln's, quote, Louisiana experiment, unquote, begins. For those of African descent, the collapse of what the Tribune called the powers that were offered some new possibilities. This extract from the April 28th, 1864 edition of Les Unions, the comments of Arnold Berthenot, a captain in the 1st Louisiana Native Guard. When the rebellion broke out, there were 43,000 free colored people in Louisiana and 312,000 slaves. There were in the city of New Orleans 20,000 colored persons, of whom only 1,000 could not read and write. In the city of New Orleans, the colored population raised a regiment. General Butler knew instinctively who were loyal, who he could count on, and who deserved all his confidence. So we opened our hearts to hope. It seemed to us that we were given a new life, and we began to make some beautiful dreams. The Louisiana Native Guard, later the Corps d'Afrique, enlisted in the Union Army. They were the first Black soldiers to see combat during the Civil War. The Union's first Black officers, mostly French-speaking free men of color, led these troops. Many of these officers, those who survived the war, would become leaders in an emerging civil rights movement that coalesced around Les Unions and later the New Orleans Tribune. The war also brought unprecedented dislocation as Union forces occupied St. Charles Parish and other country parishes. A mass self-emancipation took place. Tens of thousands of enslaved refugees freed themselves and headed for New Orleans. Union occupiers were unprepared for the influx of refugees. An enormous humanitarian crisis faced the city. On September 27th, 1862, Dr. Roudané, his brother Jean-Baptiste Roudané, and Paul Draven unleashed Les Unions, the South's first Black newspaper. The French language tri-weekly was widely read in the free colored community and advanced their claims to citizenship rights. While Les Unions attacked slavery, advocated for the enslaved, and supported Black soldiers, the paper focused on the interests of its French-speaking constituency. In November of 1863, great frustration with the Union's treatment of free and freed Blacks resulted in a series of meetings at Economy Hall. It was decided to take the issue to Washington. Nearly 1,000 men of African descent signed a petition at Economy Hall demanding voting rights for both free men of color and the newly emancipated. Dr. Roudané's brother, Jean-Baptiste Roudané, and Arnold Berthenot delivered the petition to Lincoln in the White House on March 12, 1864. Lincoln was impressed and immediately wrote a letter to Louisiana Governor Michael Hahn, suggesting limited Black suffrage. Hahn ignored Lincoln's recommendations, and the push for equal rights and voting rights stalled. So it was becoming increasingly problematic for La Union to navigate these disheartening political and racial currents. As slavery was gradually disappearing in Louisiana, the distinctions between free people of color and the emancipated was also gradually disappearing. An Americanized racial construct of black and white was rapidly solidifying, and conservative forces that equated citizenship with whiteness were gaining ground. If a new racial democracy was to be won, a majority coalition of free blacks and the 332,000 formerly enslaved Louisianans would be crucial. With the tide turning against them, it was time for a new battle plan. And La Union last appeared on July 19th, 1864. Just 2 days later, Dr. Roudané unleashed a new and decidedly more radical newspaper. The New Orleans Tribune, La Tribune de la Nouvelle-Orléans, defiantly vowed to, quote, spare no means, unquote, to promote equality for all men of African descent. To reach a much wider audience, each issue of the Tribune appeared in English and in French. In a strategic shift, the Tribune walked away from old divisions between free people of color and the enslaved, stating, quote, they are of us and we love them as we do ourselves. We are the organ of the oppressed without distinction, unquote. The newspaper desired, quote, for all colored men what we claim for ourselves, unquote. The paper envisioned a new alliance with the freedmen, embracing the importance of being united in common thought, quote, the actual liberation from social and political bondage, unquote. The solidarity between free people of color and the formerly enslaved posed a dangerous threat to white supremacy. La Tribune became a daily on October 4th, 1864. The Tribune always was a 4-page journal, 2 pages in French and 2 pages in English. The French edition was read predominantly by the old free-colored population, and it was significantly different than the English edition. The French section favored historical and philosophical essays and featured international news. The French section also featured Les Feuilletons, which was serialized novels, and also published early, often political poetry by men of African descent. And in a side note, I highly recommend a new book by Clint Bruce, published by the Historic New Orleans Collection, Afro-Creole Poetry in French from Louisiana's radical Civil War era newspapers. Dr. Bruce has done a just brilliant job in finding, discovering, uncovering these poems, which have a decidedly political character. They really tug at your heart. I highly recommend that you read the poetry that was published in the Tribune. This is one of my favorites to Reverend Chocarne. The English edition marked a deliberate effort to reach a wider audience than La Union. The paper was read by Union soldiers, government officials, Northern audiences and abolitionists, European intellectuals, and members of the United States Congress. The journal never of advanced the free copy above the emancipated. Here you can see from the November 10th, 1864 edition. Colored men desire political advancement and equal rights, but they do not desire the humbling of their brothers. There may be among our population a few aristocrats of light skin, but they are in the minority. The majority of us know by experience that caste distinctions can only create bitterness and weakness. Just from the January 7th, 1865 edition of the New Orleans Tribune, and here in an easier to read format, now we'll stay with that. The Tribune was an organizing tool. Let us organize in one body, and let us not only have public meetings in the open air, but march in procession throughout the streets and tell the inhabitants of the city, here are the freemen who come to claim their rights. As the only organ of the Black community, the Tribune was uniquely positioned to get the word out. They organized and reported on frequent mass rallies and meetings. So what were their issues? Here are a collection of various headlines from various issues. Their issues were what would become of the newly emancipated? What would replace slavery? Who would dictate the terms? Reparations via land ownership was a key issue. The Tribune organized the Freedmen's Aid Association, which sought to redistribute plantation land to the freedmen. This was in stark contrast to the Freedmen's Bureau Plan, which restored white ownership, imposed restrictive work contracts, and instituted a new Black code to regulate the system. This from two fall issues, 1864. The government should have taken possession of the lands, divided them out into 5-acre lots, and distributed them among those persons who had, by dint of daily and long continued toil, created all the wealth of the South. Sooner or later, this division of property must come about, and the sooner the better. Revolutions never go backward. Give the men of color an equal chance, and this is all they ask. Let us create a new class of landowners who shall be interested in the permanent establishment of a new and truly Republican system, the prize for which we are now fighting, and we are sure to succeed. The Tribune frequently documented the poor treatment of Black soldiers in the Union Army. Black officers were politically active and rallied around the Tribune. They had demonstrated their bravery in the battlefield and believed that the bayonet meant the ballot. In May of 1867, the Tribune covered pitched battles over the segregated streetcar system. City officials integrated the streetcars in the city later that year. And if the so-called star cars could be done away with, reasoned the Tribune, so could the star schools. The Tribune campaigned vigorously for integrated public schools. Free Blacks had long paid taxes for schools their children could not attend. The new Freedmen's Bureau schools for Blacks were poorly funded, crowded, and simply not equal. From the January 30th, 1860 edition of the Tribune, we hold that the question of the schools will only be settled when all children, without discrimination on account of race or color, will be admitted to sit together on the same benches and receive from the same teachers the light of knowledge. The Tribune challenged a very unjust legal system. The editorial, "Is the Black Code Still in Force?" appeared in the inaugural edition. And the editorial, "Is There Any Justice for the Black?" appeared in the December 15th, 1864 edition. That latter editorial was widely copied in the Northern press, and for the first time put the Tribune in front of a national audience. The Tribune also decried Union policies of accommodation with returning rebels. The South was allowed to accept defeat without repentance and to accept emancipation without equality. The North was in a position to dictate the terms of how the freedmen would be treated, how the land would be organized, and who would be able to vote. But President Johnson's lenient policies ensured white economic and political control. Unrepentant rebels were in firm control of the country parishes. The Tribune was the only paper to report on widespread violence against the freedmen. This from the December 13th, 1865 edition. Corpses are found floating in the bayous or suspended from trees along the roads. These victims are always Blacks, and no investigation is ever made to ascertain how they came to their death. The dead bodies found floating in the bayous are also those of Black men, and they generally bear wounds showing that the victims had been shot. The Tribune self-identified as radical. This is the January 24th, 1865 edition of the Tribune, the French edition. And you can see in the center of this extract, the newspaper was spelling out their program. Voilà notre programme. And I actually took this quote and used it to begin a historical marker that graces the tomb of Louis Charles Roudané in St. Louis Cemetery, number 1. Dr. Louis Charles Roudané, 1823 to 1890. And here's the translation of that extract in English. Liberty must be the same for all men. If liberty is qualified, those who possess the least rights are not really free. We demand, therefore, like all other citizens, the right to come and go, the right to vote, the right to public instruction, the right to hold public office, the right to be judged, treated, and governed according to the common law. Frederick Douglass, a leader in the colored conventions movement, was a Tribune reader and ally. The Tribune covered the October 1864 National Convention of Colored Men convened by Douglass. Tribune supporter James Ingraham, who, by the way, also had been a captain in the Louisiana Native Guard, served as a delegate to this convention. The convention produced a platform and organizational structure to advance Black voting rights. This is a letter that Frederick Douglass had written to Tribune publisher Jean-Baptiste Roudané, and I'll read just part of it. Dear Sir, absence from home on a lecturing tour is my apology for not sooner sending you a line in answer to your inquiry whether I ever see the Tribune. I have to say that I not only see it sometimes, but that I see it and read it with very great pleasure. I am proud that a press so true and wise is devoted to the interests of liberty and equality in your southern latitude. The Negro question is a live one and will not be buried alive. If so buried, it will defy the tomb. Never, until justice is done the Negro, can this country have peace. Keep your little sheet on the breeze. Hold up this one grand idea without compromise or qualification, and we shall come out right in the end. The cause of our race is one, whether in the North or the South, and every upward movement at the South in our behalf is instantly felt here. You may depend upon me to do what I can in the right direction. With best wishes, I am, dear sir, very truly yours, Frederick Douglass. James Ingraham returned from the National Convention of Colored Men, and along with other Tribune activists, convened a local National Convention of Colored Men in New Orleans in January of 1865. The Tribune was declared the organ, the official organ of the National Equal Rights League in New Orleans. That league transitioned into the Friends of Universal Suffrage later that year and eventually became the Republican Party of Louisiana. The Tribune was the official organ of both the Friends of Universal Suffrage and the Republican Party. And keep in mind that the Republican Party at that time was more progressive than the Democratic Party. This from the January 15th, 1865 Tribune. They were reporting on the convention. The day of the meeting of this convention has inaugurated a new era. It was the first political move ever made by the colored people in the state acting in a body. There were seated side by side the rich and the poor, the literate and educated man and the country laborer, hardly released from bondage, distinguished by only the natural gifts of the mind. There, the rich landowner, the opulent tradesman, seconded motions offered by humble mechanics and free men, ministers of the gospel, officers and privates of the United States Army, men who handled the sword or the pen, merchants and clerks. All classes of society were represented and united in a common thought, the actual liberation from social and political bondage. Suffrage for all men of African descent was the Tribune's ultimate goal. In the fall of 1865, the Friends of Universal Suffrage organized 2 voluntary elections to demonstrate the fervor with which Blacks would go to the polls. Blacks first voted for delegates to an upcoming convention of the Friends of Universal Suffrage, and a separate mock election was held to send a representative to Washington to advocate Black voting rights. Over 19,000 unofficial ballots were cast. The simulated vote was a powerful display of Black power and an enormous symbolic victory for the Tribune. From the November 7th, 1865 Tribune commenting on these voluntary elections. It will not be said any longer that the people of color are indifferent to their rights when we see them coming out in full force by tens of thousands to attend the polls organized by those people themselves with all the forms of law, and after 2 months of preparatory operations at the registration bureaus. It will not be said any longer that the disenfranchised, if admitted to the legal polls, would be a cause of disorder and trouble, since we have seen them yesterday voting in the calmest and most ordinary manner without the concourse of public officers or the aid of state authorities. It will not be said any longer that their choice would be indiscriminate, since they showed their good sense and patriotism by electing a sincere unionist and a tried and true friend of liberty and freedom, while the legal voters had no other candidates other than copperheads or even rebels. On July 30th, 1866, Black men gathered at the Mechanics Institute in a renewed effort for voting rights. The plan was to reconvene the 1864 State Convention and approve planks to ensure Black voting rights. And they were met with extreme violence. A year later, the Tribune recounted the horror of that day. 1 year ago today, blood was running through our streets, and the report of firearms was heard as volleys of muskets on the battlefield. The spirit of slavery had preconcerted and organized a massacre of abolitionists and Black men and was carrying out its fiendish purpose. Defenseless people murdered in cold blood, innocent men pursued from house to house and from street to street, the assassins dipping their handkerchiefs in the blood of Unionists to carry them as trophies, Black children taken out of the city cars and mercilessly murdered on the sidewalks of Canal Street, wounded men piled up in carts and fired at by the rebel police, dying men refused a drop of water, prisoners inhumanely treated in the cells of the city hall and threatened with being hung within a few hours. The massacre prompted an enormous national outcry. Clearly, Louisiana government was incapable of reconstructing itself. The fall national elections were won in a landslide by radical Republicans who now had a veto-proof majority in both houses of Congress. Radical Reconstruction Acts were quickly passed, which mandated that new state constitutions be drafted, which had to include Black voting rights and had to be implemented under military authority. This from the October 30th, 1867 edition of the Tribune. But men must understand how the time has changed. We now have the ballot to use on our own behalf. We have more than the ballot. We compose a majority in the state, and with the help of our radical friends, we compose a majority in the convention. We are therefore able to make the law. We have not to receive it from anybody. It is for us to promise situations to our friends. It is for us to distribute offices and favors. We will put into office those whom we have confidence. We need not wait that they be kind enough to place our men in. For the colored masses are now the masters of the field. Everything depends on the colored vote. It is derision and shame for the white man's party to offer us what we hold in our hand. This is the full page front cover illustration in the November, I think 16th, 1867 Harper's Weekly entitled The First Vote. And here we see voting officially for the first time, a freedman, a free man of color, and a Union Army officer. In August of 1867, over 82,000 persons of color were officially registered to vote for the first time in Louisiana history. In September of that year, over 70,000 Black Louisianans officially voted for the first time, electing many Black delegates to the state constitutional convention. The 1867 Louisiana Constitutional Convention delivered a really, truly groundbreaking blueprint for the state's future that included almost everything the Tribune had campaigned for, including universal male suffrage, abolition of the Black codes, racially proportional representation, and integrated public schools. Black legislators were successful in the April 1868 elections for state office, and would keep the dream of racial democracy alive for several more years. And this is the famous poster of the delegates to the state constitutional convention. It also features some articles from the radical constitution that was passed in early 1868. The Tribune experienced setbacks in 1868. The new state constitution mandated elections for state office in the spring, and the Tribune's radical candidates were not slated. Thomas Durant declined the newspaper's endorsement for governor, and the Tribune subsequently supported Francis Dumas. Dumas was a former freedman of color. He received the most votes on the first ballot, but was 4 votes short of the required majority. On the second ballot, white moderate Henry Warmoth defeated Dumas by 2 votes. The Tribune faction abandoned the Republican Party and slated their own candidates. This turned out to be politically a suicidal move. The party rebuked the Tribune, and the paper lost state sponsorship. Without political power and financial support, the Tribune largely ceased to exist after April of 1868. This is an image of the offices of La Union and the New Orleans Tribune. It is located at 527 Conti Street. That's on the downriver side of Conti Street between Charter and Decatur. And in 2018, I successfully won a 5-year battle to install a historical marker on the Tribune building. It's the first marker in the French Quarter. The first marker. Think of all the buildings that were constructed in the 19th century by enslaved labor. The first building in the French Quarter, the first marker to recognize Black resistance and achievement. And you can see from the marker itself, this building was the location of La Union, the South's first Black newspaper, and the New Orleans Tribune, the first Black daily. So I'd mentioned Dr. Roudané is buried in St. Louis Cemetery number 1. This is his tomb. You can see the historical marker there. I authored that marker as I did the Tribune building marker, and hosted a dedication ceremony and forum in March of 2015. That was the 125th anniversary of Dr. Louis Charles Roudané's death. And there is a close-up image of the historical marker itself. So in closing, I hope you've been inspired by the history and legacy of these 2 newspapers. I hope you've enjoyed reading the extracts. You know, in my humble opinion, these newspapers established a clear roadmap for racial democracy. And I believe that roadmap can help guide us today to collectively educate, organize, build solidarity, and again, fight for fundamental systemic change instead of incremental reforms. My book that Dr. Scott mentioned is available at Community Book Center in New Orleans, also at the shop of the Historic New Orleans Collection. It features over 25 extracts from the newspapers. It has more than 30 beautiful illustrations, a detailed map of Tribune-related sites, and a detailed historical timeline. The fall edition of 64 Parishes magazine featured an article that I wrote, United for Justice, and I encourage you to read that article as well. To learn more, you may visit my website shown here, www.roudané.com, or also my Facebook page, and I believe we'll be providing that information also in the chat. And with that, I will conclude my slideshow. And again, thanks for having me and for allowing me to get the word out about these extraordinary journals.
Thank you so much, Mark. That was very informative. So we already have some questions in the Q&A feature at the bottom of you all's screen. Thank you for the first two questions, and I will proceed from there. So the first question is, how can one access copies of La Tribune in the original French?
Okay, I'll take that. Copies of the original Tribune, French and in English, are scattered in various libraries and repositories. The library at Tulane has hard copies of many of the Tribunes, some of the Les Unions. Copies exist, hard copies exist at the Wisconsin Historical Society, at the Boston Athenaeum Museum, and also at the American Antiquarian Society in Massachusetts. Many of these Tribunes that we can find hard copies of were preserved by the Library of Congress on microfilm, and they can be accessed on the third floor of the New Orleans Public Library once they open up, and may be accessible through other means. Those microfilms were digitized by a private corporation and are available to be viewed for a subscription price. Now, many universities subscribe to that digitized service, and I know for a fact that you can go to Tulane as an example and look at digitized copies without having to pay for a subscription.
Thank you. Next question. Is a copy of the map with the sites of the slave pens, yards available at the Historic New Orleans Collection?
Yes, it's available, and you know, I don't have the link. I didn't provide that link in the things that I shared with you, Dr. Scott, but it is available. The Sites of the Slave Trade Project has a app-based mobile tour that you can download on your phone, and you can walk around, and it's really quite excellent. Visit these sites and listen to a narrative which describes the history of those individual sites. The map itself is available, and I believe it's at the Historic New Orleans Collection.
I do want to add that Mr. Roudané has provided all of the links to a lot of the information that he shared, including how to access his book, and other information. So we will be providing that in the follow-up email. Next question. What was the role of Catholicism in the life of Roudané and the work of the paper?
Well, that's a great question. Dr. Roudané was baptized Catholic in St. James Parish in 1823. And I have no confirmation of how carefully he practiced his Catholic religion. I do know that he was married at St. Louis Cathedral in the quarter, and that he attended Jesuit church in the business district. Many free people of color walked away from the Catholic faith during the Civil War and Reconstruction eras. Quite frankly, many were disgusted with the church's support for the Confederacy and enslavement. Some of those people may have continued to attend church on a ceremonial basis, perhaps for Easter or Christmas or whatever. Others rejected that form of spirituality and became spiritualists. There was a large spiritualist movement in New Orleans at that time. And many of the men who wrote and worked with the Tribune, wrote for and worked with the Tribune, were spiritualists. I don't have any concrete evidence that Dr. Roudané was a regular attendee at his church. He may have been, he may not have been. I just don't know. I do know that the newspaper frequently took the Catholic Church for their support of the Confederacy.
Thank you. Can you tell us something about Paul Draven?
Well, that's a great question. Paul Draven was an extraordinarily well-versed, classically educated free man of color. And he was a teacher at the Couvent School, which many consider the incubator for revolution in 19th century New Orleans. He also, of course, was the editor of L'Union, and for a short time, the editor of the New Orleans Tribune. He also filed suit in the 1870s against the nascent New Orleans public school system for not allowing children of color to attend certain schools. He later became part of the movement, the second wave of Afro-Creole activism that produced the Plessy Challenge, and also was a supporter and I believe an author of The Crusader, published by Louis Martinet. I'm especially happy that Paul Draven wrote the obituary for Dr. Roudané, which provided a lot of historical information. Unfortunately, we don't have any pictures of Mr. Draven. I wish I could share an image with him in our discussion.
Thank you. Did the Union and Tribune have advertisements? If yes, what was advertised?
Yeah. Advertisements were small. They were relatively infrequent. Those who did advertise typically were tobacconists, tailors, small coffee houses, and places where people could purchase dry goods. There weren't that many advertisements. There weren't graphics associated with them, but it's fascinating to look at them, not only in terms of what they were selling, but also who was involved. So we can see many of the merchants in the French Quarter and in Tremé and in the Marigny were prosperous, free men of color and free women of color.
Thank you. You mentioned a geographically diverse readership. What was the paper's circulation and how many copies approximately were distributed or read outside of Louisiana?
At its peak, the Tribune claimed a daily circulation of 3,000 copies. So I don't know the trajectory when they actually reached their peak, but the newspaper was read in the North and, as I mentioned, copied widely in the Northern press. I do know that, according to Rousseff, every member of Congress, both senators and congressmen, received every issue of the New Orleans Tribune. European intellectuals received delayed copies of the Tribune. And in 1866, the Tribune subscribed to the services of the United Press, the wire services of the United Press. And you can see in my book, there's an image of the Tribune office, which at that time was located on Exchange Alley, where the Louisiana State Supreme Court building is now. You can actually see the telegraph pole directly in front of the Tribune office. Of course, this allowed them to transmit articles to Northern press and also receive articles from correspondents. And there were Tribune correspondents in Europe and all over the North who would send articles for publication in the newspaper.
Thank you. What similarities and differences do you see between the political turmoil we are dealing with now and what Roudané and his coworkers experienced in the 1860s? And what specific lessons can we learn from that history when fighting for justice today?
I think that's the essential question. You know, on the most basic level, in 1860s New Orleans, we see oppressed people fighting for racial democracy while they're being opposed by conservative forces who procrastinate, spread misinformation, disenfranchise, and otherwise thwart racial democracy. Now, if we think about that, those opposing forces, the oppressed and the oppressor, in terms of race, we see the same thing happening today. It's glaringly obvious. In terms of the lessons that I glean from the newspaper, and this is a repeat, but it's worth repeating. The newspaper teaches us how important it is to educate, first of all. Secondly, to agitate. Third, to organize. Fourth, to build solidarity. They actually worked to build solidarity between free people of color and the newly freed. And that solidarity represented the greatest single threat to white supremacy. And I think the same could be said for today. And finally, they really consistently advocated for fundamental systemic change, not incremental reforms. So those lessons, educate, agitate, organize, build solidarity, and work for fundamental systemic change are the lessons that I take from the Tribune, which I can apply to today's world.
Thank you. There's a group of similar questions, so I'll just ask all three because they're very similar. So one question is, who wrote the articles? But this out and give me a moment for the other two questions. Are there any, no, that's not the one. Who wrote them? A similar question is, did Frederick Douglass or other well-known Black abolitionists write articles for the Tribune? And then another one is similar but a little different. Regarding the paper's advocacy for voting rights, did the issue of women's suffrage ever come up at all? So sort of who wrote these articles, and did the issue of women's suffrage come up?
Great questions. Unfortunately, we don't have bylines. You know, I've read every single known edition of both newspapers in French and English. In fact, I've reread and read again those issues. And very seldom do we ever see a byline. You never see by Paul Draven or by Dr. Roudané. Many of the editorials, certainly most of them in La Union, and many in the 1864 editions of the Tribune were written by Paul Draven because that's what he did. Occasionally, we'll see a byline from a correspondent, and often those also are difficult to identify because they use pseudonyms. They don't use their real name. So we're left to try to tease out who that person might be. In terms of the poetry that was published in the newspapers, we are able to, thanks again to Dr. Clint Bruce, to pin down who the authors were for some of the first Black poetry in the United States. Also on the point of Frederick Douglass, the only time I ever have seen anything written by Douglass in the newspapers was the letter that I shared with you. It should be pointed out that there are numerous issues of the Tribune, actually about 30% of the total number that were ever published, that have disappeared from the historical record. The copies have been lost. So there could have been something there. In terms of women, I'm going to read something that's from the January 31st, 1867 French issue that I translated. And I think this kind of captures the Tribune's take on women. The Influence of Women was the title of the article. But men, free men, do not have to passively receive what they are granted. They have rights to claim. The spouses, the sisters, the mothers of our citizens probably understand it. And far from diverting these citizens from any participation in public life, they should take pleasure in supporting and encouraging them in their noble designs. They should be the angels who inspire the cause of freedom. So as much as I would like to say that there was a strong female voice in the Tribune, that women participated politically, I have to say they were relegated to the sidelines. And we have to remember that women of color undoubtedly built political power within their own spheres, especially within the church or benevolent societies. Dr. Roudanez's wife helped organize a group of women to benefit an orphanage. And we know that Louisiana women of all races had more autonomy and economic power than anywhere else in the United States, thanks to the Napoleonic and Spanish legal codes. Free women of color owned a lot of property. Celie Saleh, the doctor's wife, owned a ton of property in the French Quarter and the business district. They transacted business in their own names. So they had economic power. The Tribune in general tried to flip the script of the white stereotype of Black women. And the white stereotype being, of course, that women were immoral and promiscuous, and white men were free to exploit that. Another quote from an 1865 issue of the Tribune captures that. For the colored women, we claim the same regard as for the white ones. They are, as well as the women of any other race, mothers, sisters, wives, and daughters. They partake of the same feelings, and we do not want to see them rebuked by men in offices and treated not as women, but as brutes.
Thank you. I can't help but think of a lot of the scholars that came out of the a lot of the scholars that came out of the 1960s in as it relates to Black women and how I remember reading a lot in terms of their perspective. It was always just support the Black man, supportive, that's what it made me think of when you just read that. But one of the things that's coming up, I had a question, but it relates to this other question I'm about to ask is, this is the question, and then here's my question. So the question is, Dr. Roudané and his allies were enormously courageous men in a very violent city. Do you ever wonder how they escaped attack given their high profile roles in the city's civil rights movement? And my question I was going to ask, but you all had so many questions and I'm very grateful. Oh my gosh, you are such a great audience. But my question to follow up with that is, was the end or the discontinuation of the Union partly the result of white mobs harassing the organization?
Okay. That has been said in secondary sources. The numerous secondary sources that attribute the closing of Les Unions to threats to burn down the offices of the Tribune and attack the staff of the Tribune, the writers and publisher and founder of the Tribune. But nowhere in the papers themselves do I see any coverage of those threats. So it's doubtless true that these men had targets on their back. And yes, I've often wondered how Dr. Roudané could walk the 3 blocks from his home on Custom House Street to the Tribune offices without being spotted and attacked. But that didn't happen. And I'm thankful that it didn't happen. The city was howling mad, and the questioner is right. Violence was pervasive against both free people of color and the newly freed enslaved population. And I think there was another question in there, but I forgot it.
It was, what was it? Did you ever wonder how they escaped attack given their high profile roles in the city's civil rights movements?
Yeah, I do. I wonder. I often wondered, were they armed? Did they have bodyguards? I do know that Jean Charles Roudané, who was the second editor of the Tribune, mentions in his memoir that during the course of the Mechanics Institute massacre, the call went out from the white mob, onto the Tribune. And the editor feared that the offices would be burned to the ground. And according to Roudané, the mob did approach the offices on Conti Street, but were fended off by a contingent of Black Union Army officers. And again, I have no confirmation of that ever having happened other than the memoir of the editor. So, being a historian, I always like to get a second confirmation of something like that. I unfortunately don't have it.
Certainly, thank you. Are there any known connections of the Tribune to Haiti and the Haitian Revolution in particular?
Actually, surprisingly, there's very little on the Haitian Revolution in the Tribune. I would have predicted to see historical coverage, especially in the French edition, of the 1804, 1791 to 1804 rebellion that established the first independent Black republic in the Western Hemisphere, the first successful slave insurrection in history in the Western Hemisphere. I would expect, because the Tribune covered a lot of history, that I would find it there, but I don't. I do find mention of Haiti in current politics. So there is some commentary occasionally in the Tribune about what was happening in Haiti in the 1860s. But unfortunately, not any historical coverage that I've been able to find on the revolution itself. And I'm surprised also because the specter of slave uprising made manifest in Haiti haunted the white planters throughout slave history in Louisiana. They constantly lived in fear of an enslaved uprising like the one that happened in January of 1811, the largest slave insurrection in American history. Slaves liberated themselves and marched on to New Orleans with a plan to capture the city and establish a Black republic. So in short, I'm surprised that the Tribune didn't cover more about the Haitian Revolution, but I've been unable to find anything.
Thank you. Two sort of related questions. One is, how did these newspapers influence tourism in Louisiana? And the other is, was there any reference to food-related events, recipes, agriculture, or dinners?
So tourism and food, those are the questions?
Yes.
Okay. I see nothing in the newspapers in terms of content or advertising that involves tourism, or even comments about tourists in the city. In terms of food, I kept searching over and over again for some gumbo recipe that I could use. But there's nothing. I find no recipes or any real significant commentary about food.
Thank you. To produce 4 pages of content, half in English and half in French, is a huge amount of work. What was the size of the Tribune's staff?
Well, we don't know for sure, and I'm sure it varied from day to day, but the core group consisted of about 6 people. And the press itself was on the first floor. The offices were on the second floor. If you think about it, not only are they putting out a newspaper which is promoting a meeting that's going to happen that night at Economy Hall, then they go to Economy Hall and write a report on what happened, and then go back to the Tribune office and then do an editorial and an article about that for the next day's issue. It was really almost a 24-hour operation that was really staffed by about 6 people. In terms of writers, I know Dr. Roudané wrote, I know Paul Draven wrote, I know that editor Uzo did the lion's share of the writing for the newspaper. It was said that he worked there between 18 and 20 hours every day just to get the next issue out.
Wow, thank you. Can you talk about the streetcar strike and explain the streetcars? Wait, the streetcar strike and explain the star cars? I don't know.
Okay.
It says star cars, but maybe they're talking about streetcars.
No, there were cars that were marked with a star that were for Black people only in the city. The streetcars segregated. There were the so-called star cars. Okay. And, separate and not equal. So there was very poor service. These were mule-drawn streetcars, very poor service in general, but almost no service at all for people of color because they weren't allowed to get on them. And frustration just built to a boil in May of 1867. And there were spontaneous revolts all over the city. It's often referred to as the month of the streetcar battles in New Orleans. In fact, there was a large group of about 500 individuals who gathered at Congress Square and actually seized and took over the streetcars. And the city was so alarmed that they would witness a repeat of the 1866 Mechanics Institute massacre that they basically capitulated. They said, okay, we're going to do away with the star cars. So it was a really pretty quick and clean victory after a short uprising. And the Tribune immediately said, well, hey, that was easy. If it's so easy to do away with the star cars, let's do away with the star schools. Now, the star schools were fictional. They weren't really star schools, but the Tribune was saying, you know, the few schools that we have are so poor that it's like having a star streetcar system. We have a star educational system that's separate and completely unequal.
Thank you. So we have three last questions. Well, I'll just ask these. These are three very extensive questions, but very interesting. Okay, so this one is a genealogy question. There were 3 to 4 waves of Saint-Domingue Haitian refugees that left Haiti and went to Louisiana and a number of other places. We know the biggest wave came to New Orleans in 1809 with roughly 10,000 people. Most stayed in the city of New Orleans. Was Dr. Roudané born in St. James Parish?
Yes. Again, his mother was enslaved in Saint-Domingue, and I have uncovered records, primary documents, which indicate that she fled as an infant in arms, of course, with her enslaved mother and their owner, and were picked up by a boat and eventually found themselves in Baltimore. And from Baltimore, eventually they found themselves in St. James Parish. When this, my third great grandmother, Amy Potens, arrived in St. James Parish, she hooked up with Louis Roudané, who was also from Saint-Domingue. And that's when they had children together, including Dr. Roudané. So again, the very first wave of slave insurrection resulted in the Roudanés coming to North America and to St. James Parish. And that's because they lived in Dondon, which was just about 10 kilometers south of Cap Français, which is where the revolution started in 1791. And when the insurgents seized Dondon, several of the Roudané family members who were white colonists were massacred. I have evidence, documentation of 2 who were massacred. And those who escaped eventually find themselves in St. James Parish.
Thank you. There is an active Tribune newspaper in New Orleans. When did this newspaper become active after the Louisiana Tribune newspaper went defunct in the late 1800s?
Good question, yeah. Dwight and Beverly McKenna, Mark McKenna, James Borders, I hope I'm not forgetting anybody, founded the modern New Orleans Tribune in 1985. So they've been around for a while. And the McKennas were inspired by Dr. Roudané. Dr. McKenna, Dwight McKenna, is a medical doctor. And they decided to name their new newspaper, the Tribune, in honor of the legacy that was established by the first Tribune. And the New Orleans Tribune continues to be published this day.
Thank you. Last question for the evening. In 19th century Europe, systemic change looked like social revolution. Systemic change in the moment of these journals became a battle for universal suffrage, a politics of integration. Today, we all have access to the ballot. What then should our political tactics look like today if we have achieved the suffrage and the social integration previously fought for, but still live in a world where systemic racism and white supremacy stand strong?
Well, that's a huge question. It requires a very long answer, which I will not attempt. But I will say this, that, in my humble opinion, the struggle today is to dismantle completely all symbols and all systems of white supremacy. Now, practically, how is that achieved? It can be achieved on a number of different fronts. And, there's a long list of things that we can do if we want to actively challenge and change that system. But I would underscore the fact that all of us, regardless of where we're coming from, have a sphere of influence, and we can act within that sphere of influence to affect change. And the Tribune taught me that it's important to use your voice. And not only use your voice, but get it out there loud and clear so a lot of people will hear it. So that's one thing that inspires me, and I think we all, within our spheres of influence, can do. And then on a more systems level change, I think we all can work on programs and on policy changes that will begin to turn the system upside down. And there's so many different ways that can be done. I'm not even going to begin to talk about that.
Thank you so much. I want to say to our audience, thank you so much for this evening. I thoroughly enjoyed you all's questions. Mark, thank you. I thoroughly enjoyed your presentation. I learned something every time we meet, something new. And so I'd like to bid you all a good evening. Thank you all so much. You've been such a great audience. And Mark, thank you for sharing your work with us in some of your findings from your research and your book and all of the knowledge and encouragement that you imparted with us.
My pleasure.
So have a good night, everyone, and take care.